Hello and welcome. Can Afghans have real security if Pakistan's issues remain unresolved? It's the challenge now facing those trying to implement the new US and NATO military strategy for Afghanistan. Another deadly bombing in Pakistan on Monday raised more questions about the government's capacity to maintain domestic stability, just at a time when allied forces most need Islamabad's support to defeat Al-Qaeda and Taliban militants in the region. Pakistani troops are already engaged in a major offensive in South Waziristan against domestic extremists. The military escalation in neighbouring Afghanistan has raised fears that a large number of Afghan fighters will cross over into Pakistan, out of the direct reach of the US and NATO troops. Others are concerned that thousands of Afghan refugees will flee the conflict and create a huge problem for the fragile Pakistani government, which is already questioning the lack of clarity on Pakistan's role in the new strategy announced by US President Barack Obama last week. Today we ask, how effective can Pakistan be as a partner to the US and NATO in fighting Al-Qaeda? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we'll welcome your phone calls onto the show as well. Joining us to discuss the issues is Maleeha Lohdi, Pakistan's former ambassador to the US and High Commissioner to the UK. She's the recipient of numerous international awards and was founding editor of the leading English daily paper in Pakistan, the News International. Dr. Lohdi joins us from London. And from New York, Christine Fair, professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fair is also a former political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul. Ladies, I welcome you both to the show. And Ambassador, if I could start with you first. There's terrible news coming out of Pakistan as we do this show live, of course, the mounting death toll following the bomb attacks in Lahore and in Peshawar. And these are just the latest in a string of attacks in Pakistan that have claimed more than 400 lives in just a matter of weeks. What do you believe to be the greatest motivating factor for these attackers? Is it simply revenge for Pakistani government forces attacking the Taliban in strongholds in the northwest of the country, or is there something deeper?
Well, to start with, I think it shows the severity and the gravity of the security challenge that Pakistan faces. And I think this violent backlash is because of the successful, effective military operations that Pakistan has undertaken in Swat and more recently, of course, in South Waziristan, which is still going on. So I think what we're looking at is the militants are raising also the costs of possible, potential, future Pakistani cooperation with the United States and NATO forces in Afghanistan. So here we have militants of various stripes, I think showing that they can strike across Pakistan in different cities. I mean, today we saw bombings in Peshawar as well as Lahore. And in recent days, we've seen mounting bombings in different parts of Pakistan. So I think the challenge is enormous. And the important question is going to be down the road whether President Obama's strategy really will help to stabilize Pakistan, or will it unintendedly destabilize Pakistan?
Now, we'll look at some of those issues, Ambassador, in a moment, but let me ask you, with these attacks taking so many civilian lives, women and children being killed in these, and they're pretty gruesome, what chance is there could be a public backlash against these militants, that they could lose any kind of base support because of the mounting civilian casualties?
Well, I think that remains a threat. There is a danger that public consensus, which was forged with such difficulty in recent months, could come under pressure. But I think one of the things that has been evident in the last few weeks is that, in fact, the public has not been deterred by these attacks, and public consensus has solidified. Public anger has grown against the militants, and in fact, the public political consensus has actually become stronger rather than weaker. But obviously, if the authorities fail to protect citizens in the next few weeks, next few months, then obviously this consensus is fragile. It can come under great strain.
Well, Dr. Christine Fair, glad to have you with us as well from New York. And I wonder, while focusing on the issues in Afghanistan, President Obama recently seemed to leave out a lot about Pakistan's role in the region. Why do you think that is? And it seems to contradict his effort to try to look at the region as a whole.
No, I think that's a really good point. If you compare the most recent plan to the plan that was revealed in March, what most is evident is that there really is no Pakistan strategy. And I think in some sense, many people in Washington are more alarmed by the developments in Pakistan than they are in Afghanistan. You know, the problem that Pakistan confronts is obviously numerous. You know, I very much agree with what Ambassador Lohdi said. The public opinion polling, in terms of public opinion towards the militant campaign the military's campaign to root out the militants is very robust. The militants really engage in strategic overreach when they ran into Bunair in April, and that's when you really see Pakistani public opinion turning against the Pakistan Taliban. However, there is the other real problem that greatly bothers Washington, and that is that the Pakistan Taliban, which of course focuses the attention of the Pakistan military, which has lost many, many lives contending with that threat, but what we still haven't gotten from Pakistan is cooperation against the Afghan Taliban. And so there is this growing sense of frustration that Pakistan is absolutely key to stability in the region. And the United States would very much like to have a strategic partner with Pakistan. But there is this growing sense of frustration that in reality, the goals of the United States and Pakistan are not strictly speaking in alignment. So when you don't have strategic goals that are relatively in alignment, a strategic partnership is going to be very difficult to forge. And one of the areas of contention are groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Afghan Taliban, even though we are collaborating and support each other in our joint efforts against al-Qaeda and the Pakistan Taliban.
Well, I wonder, Dr. Faird, are you worried about that idea of a lot of the Afghan fighters being forced over the border and finding shelter in Pakistan because of this lack of cooperation you describe?
Well, of course, this has been one of the problems with this conflict for the last 8 years, is that the border simply can't be sealed off. That was why the Taliban were able to mount such a resurgence in 2005, because they had made a recuperative retreat into Pakistan's tribal territories. Now, the Pakistanis have evidenced quite a bit of concern about this. Now, it is important to remember, though, that the Afghan Taliban have no particular beef with the Pakistan government. This is where the distinction of the Tehreek-e-Taliban-e-Pakistan, the so-called Pakistan Taliban, and the Afghan Taliban under Mullah Omar needs to be remembered. They're not the same organization. They share some overlapping networks. They share some connections with al-Qaeda. They share an affinity for an archipelago of Deobandi madrasas. But the organization's respective objectives and efforts to achieve those objectives are really quite different. So I know it's a concern, but the Afghan Taliban do not see Pakistan primarily as its enemy. Mm-hmm. I also don't think that since the Afghan Taliban is an effective insurgent organization, that it's simply going to retreat from the fight. I don't think that's very likely either. A more probable concern, I do think, is the displacement of Afghans fleeing the conflict. The majority of the U.S. troops are going to be concentrated in the south, and that's going to be abutting the Pakistan territory of Baluchistan. So I understand that the Pakistanis say that this is an issue, but the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban are really two distinct organizations.
Well, I want to.
The larger issue is the humanitarian crisis.
I'll get onto that in a second. I want to on this subject, get an email that we got in, and I want to put this to Ambassador Lodi. It came in from a viewer named Syed Zaki Ahmed, who wrote in saying, some of the Afghan Taliban will cross the borders, but many of them will hide in Afghanistan, and this will give them time to organize themselves more. As the Taliban have said, you have the watches, but we have the time. Now, that's true to some degree, isn't it? The Taliban can afford basically to sit back until the sort of allied resources have basically expired and they no longer can keep up the fight.
Well, I think the fundamental flaw at the heart of President Obama's strategy, which he's recently announced, is that it really doesn't address this issue that you've just identified from this email. It is a military plan. He's rolled out a military plan, but there is no political strategy. He does speak in passing about the need or the fact that the US will support the Afghan government's efforts to reach out to those elements of the Taliban that are prepared to abandon violence. But I think that falls short of a reconciliation plan. And I think everybody, I mean, Dr. Fair was talking about the frustration in Washington about my country. Well, let me tell you about the frustration in my country about US policy, because what has effectively happened in the last 8 years is that a flawed strategy has pushed the conflict into Pakistan, into its tribal region, and it has actually pushed the entire battlefront into Pakistan. Now, what can happen as a consequence of President Obama's strategy of military escalation in Afghanistan, as well as an expansion of drone attacks in Pakistan itself, which is implicit in his speech. This is the unstated part of the speech. In fact, I happen to think that more significant than what he said was what he didn't say in his speech, and this is part of what he didn't say, but it is implied, And also, there have been a series of leaked articles in many American newspapers which are talking about an expansion of this covert war in Pakistan. Now, I happen to think, so do many Pakistanis, that should this happen, this will simply shake the public consensus that I was talking about a little earlier. It can also unravel the military gains that Pakistan's army has achieved, because what it will do is to stretch the Pakistan army into areas as part of the hammer and anvil strategy that the US Army will wish Pakistan to play a part in. And at a time when the Pakistan army is overstretched, I mean, you talked about the incidents only today. If you look back, something like 3,000 security personnel have lost their lives in Pakistan. 15 to 20,000 people have died in Pakistan since 2001. And we see these killings just go on. So I do think that a policy or a strategy of military escalation, which is essentially what the Obama plan is, it's a surge, and it's also an expansion of what we will see probably in Pakistan. I hope it doesn't happen, but if it does, then it will simply inflame public opinion in Pakistan. It will unite the tribes with the fighters which are hiding out in North Waziristan, and it will make it infinitely harder for the Pakistani government to deal with the situation.
Well, I'll touch on more of these issues. We're going to take a very short break here, but we're back with our discussion after this short break. Don't go away.